Namaste and greetings. I, Ishika Chaudhary, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti, Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warm welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a panel discussion on the topic Gendering Vulnerability Research in the Peri-urban as a part of the series The State of Cities #City Conversations by IMPRI. As moderator, we have Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay. He is Associate Professor at Visva-Bharati, Santiniketan, and also a visiting senior fellow at IMPRI, New Delhi. We welcome you, sir. As speaker, we have Professor Vishal Narain. He is Professor at Management Development Institute, MDI, Gurgaon. We welcome you, sir. As discussants, we have Dr. Ramakrishna Nallathiga. He is Associate Professor at National Institute of Construction Management and Research, Pune. We welcome you, sir. Dr. Divya Gupta, she is Senior Research Fellow at Bharti Institute of Public Policy, Indian School of Business, ISB, Hyderabad. We welcome you, ma'am. Dr. Meenakshi Sinha, she is a postdoctoral fellow at Applied Social Sciences, Banaras Hindu University, BHU, Varanasi. We welcome you, ma'am. Sameer Unhale, he is Joint Commissioner at Directorate of Municipal Administration in Government of Maharashtra. We welcome you, sir. And Dr. Chinya Mukherjee, she is Assistant Professor at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Kharagpur. We welcome you, ma'am. We all look forward to learning from the esteemed gathering. Now I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, sir. Thank you.
So thank you, Ishika, and good evening and namaskar to all of you. On behalf of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, I once again welcome you all to this city conversation series. We started this series in 2019 with the aim of deliberating on the disparate problems of cities in developing countries, and of course with some more emphasis on the Indian cities and how to make them more livable, equitable and sustainable. And focus of today's conversation, as it is quite evident from the title, is on peri-urban areas. And broadly, these areas are the fringe areas of the cities or the adjoining rural areas, and these are closely linked with the city economy. Inhabitants of these peri-urban regions are increasingly threatened by a deteriorating quality of life, and uncontrolled growth at the periphery of the cities is occurring. The other set of problems pertain to the non-availability of infrastructure and basic services. And India is urbanizing, that is a fact. And so the concern is growing over these adverse conditions created by such uncontrolled growth and unregulated development in the peri-urban areas. And also there is official neglect and non-recognition of these areas in assigning urban civic status, creating a serious governance deficit and adapt to the vulnerabilities of these areas. Now, to understand these vulnerabilities and other related aspects in the peri-urban areas, we are fortunate to be joined by a group of eminent urban scholars and practitioners. Today, we will be hearing from Professor Vishal Narain, who is a Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the Management Development Institute, Gurgaon. And his broad research interests include interdisciplinary analysis of public policy processes and institutions, water governance, vulnerability and adaptation to the environmental change, as well as the peri-urban issues. And he was awarded with the prestigious SR Sen Prize by the Indian Society of Agricultural Economics for the book titled Institution, Technology and Water Control, Water User Associations and Irrigation Management Reformed in Two Large-Scale Systems in India. And on a personal note, I just find this book very much useful while doing some study on Water User Association in West Bengal. And he's also the author of Public Policy, A View from the South, which is published by Cambridge University Press. And apart from these books, he has authored quite a number of research papers in top-ranked journals like Land Use Policy, Geoforum, Climate Policy, Water International, and so on. And also he has been a consultant to several organizations, including FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, IWMI, the International Water Management Institute, of Colombo, the Asia Foundation, New Delhi, and Sasi Water at Hyderabad, India. And also today, as Ishika has already mentioned, that we have a discussion, Dr. Ramakrishna Nallathiga, Dr. Divya Gupta, Dr. Meenakshi Sinha, and Dr. Jenia Mukherjee. And also we will be joined by Mr. Samir Unhale. So we have a terrific panel of both urban practitioners and the urban scholars. And today, as the topic is the general vulnerability research in the peri-urban areas. So with these few words, let me hand over this virtual floor to Professor Narain for your talk. So it's over to you, Professor Narain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for the introduction, and thanks to IMPRI for the opportunity. Very nice to be here to connect with a lot of people I've heard about, and some of whose work I've read, but never interacted with in person or virtually. So just give me a moment to share my screen. Yeah. Yeah. Can you see it? Can you see the full screen? Okay.
Yes, you can.
So I've titled my talk Fluid Relations, Gendering Vulnerability Research in the Peri-urban. And what I really want to draw attention to is the changing nature of gender relations in peri-urban context. And most of my research is around, peri-urban water security issues, and that's where I'm coming from. And so my title actually has two meanings. It's fluid because it refers to water, and it's also fluidity in a relationship. So I'm trying to argue that gender relations are not static, they are transformed. And the peri-urban context provides a very fertile ground to understand transforming gender relations. So that's how I've kept the focus of my talk. So just to give you an overview of how the talk is structured. So I'll talk a little bit about contextualizing the peri-urban, and partly that's because the word peri-urban is used in different ways by different practitioners, by different scholars. And many of us may have a different frame of reference when we talk about the peri-urban. So I would like to spend some time bringing everyone to a common ground in terms of what I mean when I'm talking about the peri-urban. I would like to talk a little bit about the term vulnerability, which has acquired a lot of prominence in the scholarly literature, especially in relation to the climate change discourse, and spend a few minutes talking about what makes vulnerability gendered. I mean, if you deconstruct the concept of vulnerability, you find that in terms of exposure, adaptive capacity, sensitivity, all these are gendered. Then spend a little bit, talk a little bit about why gender in the peri-urban. Why should we be talking about gender in the peri-urban? And interestingly, there is very little on gender in the peri-urban in the scientific literature, even though the peri-urban literature has grown quite significantly over the last few decades. Then I will draw upon my own research in peri-urban Gurgaon and in Mukteshwar to talk about changing gender relations around natural resources. So what is it in the peri-urban environment? What is it in the peri-urban context that causes gender relations to be transformed? I will conclude with some key propositions from my talk, some key inferences, and then some thoughts on the way forward, also hoping that some of the discussants may want to expand on my concluding thoughts in terms of how we take forward the agenda of research, action, and capacity building in relation to the peri-urban. So peri-urban is a very loosely used term with a variety of connotations, and each one of us may have a different frame of reference, even though Dr. Chattopadhyay spoke a little bit about the peri-urban in the beginning, saying that it's places at the periphery of the city, it's a rural area, being gradually engulfed by the city, which has characteristics of both the rural and the urban environment. And that's how most of us have understood the peri-urban as a periphery of the city. And writing in the context of Southeast Asia, Mekki used the word Desa Kota. So Desa means countryside and Kota means city. So Desa Kota would basically be a place that combine features both of the rural and the urban environment. In my recent work, I've argued that while place-based definitions are important and useful in terms of drawing the attention of policymakers and planners, they will gradually lose relevance in the context of the global south. And this is basically because of the nature of urban expansion, because of the way cities are growing. And what we really have is a continuum where, you know, the boundary of one city or town ends and that of another one starts. And therefore, to think of a peri-urban area as a kind of a geographically demarcated place will become extremely problematic. And moreover, if you look at how modern Indian cities like Bangalore, Chennai, Gurgaon, Noida have grown, this coexistence of the rural and the urban can be found in the heart of the city and not necessarily at its periphery. So for instance, I live in a gated colony in Gurgaon, and as soon as I leave my colony, I'm into a rural settlement area. And from the window, from the balcony of my house, I can see a common land where people from the neighboring villages still come to pick up fodder and fuel wood and graze their livestock. So what is this? Am I living in a rural area or an urban area? And that's why I want to argue is that this kind of a place-based definition of peri-urban is gradually losing its relevance. And it's much more appropriate to think of the peri-urban as a conceptual lens, to talk about rural-urban transformations as some kind of an analytical construct, to look at the changing nature of rural spaces as they're engulfed by the city, as an analytic construct to look at the coexistence of the rural and the urban, and the changing flows of goods, services, and resources between rural and urban areas. Vulnerability. So of course, the word vulnerability has been used in many different disciplines, and in recent decades, it's caught our attention for many of us, mainly in the context of the climate change discourse. And when we talk about vulnerability, we are referring to the susceptibility to harm. And what I find extremely useful and relevant as a way of conceptualizing vulnerability is this definition which of IPCC 2007, which talks of vulnerability in terms of exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity. Along with the words resilience and adaptation, the word vulnerability has structured how we think about the impacts of climate change, how we understand the socially differentiated impacts of climate change. And donors, funders have invested huge sums of money in research and action research and vulnerability assessments to support vulnerability reduction. So that's how we engage with the word vulnerability. And I thought I would speak about it a little bit before getting on to the main subject of my talk. If we deconstruct vulnerability into its components of exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity, we find that vulnerability is gendered. Yeah, and so exposure is gendered because of the gender-based division of labor at the household and in the fields, right? Which determines what kinds of activities men and women will be engaged with, what kinds of activities men and women will be involved with, which in turn shapes their exposure to climatic events, to disasters, to all kinds of environmental change. Adaptive capacity is gendered because if you look at the access to natural capital, social capital, human capital, financial capital, physical capital, which in large part shape an individual or a household's adaptive capacity, we find that they are gendered because men and women have a differential access to all these forms of capital, whether it's land, water, forest. Men and women have different ways in which they're integrated with social networks, right? Men and women have differential access to financial capital, to physical capital. And therefore, adaptive capacity is gendered. And I understand that sensitivity is gendered due to some combination of the above. So when we deconstruct the concept of vulnerability, we find that that vulnerability to climate change, vulnerability to climate-induced disasters, vulnerability to all forms of environmental change is gendered. So a lot of studies show, and it's not surprising then, that women are more vulnerable to mortality from climate-induced and other disasters. And this often has to do with the social norms. We say that gender is a social construct. Often it has to do with social norms that militate against women despite their physical and biological strength. Yes, it may have to do with dressing codes. It may have to do with women's weaker integration with early warning systems and with their caregiving responsibilities at home. So why a gendered lens in the peri-urban? So as we understand that the peri-urban is a space in transition and it has enormous social and economic heterogeneity. So normally we talk of the peri-urban as a place of extreme poverty, but I would say that it's not just poverty, it's a place of glaring economic inequality, because we may have the peri-urban elite, like the large farmers, who may prosper through the sales of land. On the other extreme, we may have migrants, tenants, sharecroppers who lose out opportunities to earn a living. We have people who depend on the commons for access to natural resources, but the commons are engulfed by real estate, the commons are engulfed by or formally acquired through state approaches for urban expansion. So it's a space in transition with a lot of social and economic heterogeneity. And when we look at gender, and when we look at why we want to talk about gender, I would say that gender is perhaps the most basic axis of social differentiation. So, of course, it becomes meaningful in relation to other axes of social differentiation, and that's why we talk of intersectionality. Yeah, but in a space that's socially and economically very heterogeneous, gender as a most basic axis of social differentiation provides an extremely relevant and important conceptual entry point to understand inequalities in society. And if you look at the kinds of processes taking place in the peri-urban in terms of land use change, migration, occupational diversification, all these processes affect the gender-based division of labor, for example, to the feminization of agriculture, right? So these are some intuitive thoughts, but when you look at the peri-urban literature, we find that many streams of thought have grown in recent years. So we know a lot about, so there's growing literature on commons in the peri-urban. There's literature on poor access to infrastructure, on wastewater use in peri-urban agriculture, on health implications, but we know relatively little about changing gender relations in the peri-urban context, and that's really a sort of a gap that I want to address in the hope that it will stimulate other researchers also to pursue the line of inquiry. So in this larger context, so the main question for this talk today is how do processes of urbanization affect gender relations around natural resources in the peri-urban? And what are the implications of this for how we problematize and talk about gender? So I would also like to start by saying that when I started my research, I did not necessarily start explicitly with a gender focus, right? But gender was so basic to my research that it always came up. And to me, that's also one of the strengths of taking an empirical inductive approach, where you remain open to observations in the field as they emerge, and then you draw your inferences from them. So I will talk using that empirical inductive approach based on ethnographic fieldwork in Peri-urban Gurgaon in India and in Mukteshwar. So my talk builds upon my fieldwork in Budhera and Sultanpur, two villages in Peri-urban Gurgaon and Northwest India, and in Mukteshwar in the Kumaon Hills of North India. And I want to argue that the transformation in gender relations in the peri-urban interface happens in three ways. So the first way in which that happens is through the occupational diversification and the migration of men. Now, you know, we have this assumption that when we talk about gender and water, we assume that it's women who collect water. And we have, reports of donors, funders, that work on water with a cover page showing women carrying pots of water on their heads. But when I was doing my fieldwork in Sultanpur village, about 15 to 20 kilometers from Santiniketan, Gurgaon, I found that in the upper caste, in the Rajput families, women did not go out to collect water. It was considered to be against their maryada, that's the word that they use, against norms of social dignity, right? However, with land use change, in the peri-urban space, men started moving out to the city on a daily basis to work. So they had not necessarily migrated, but they would move to and fro to the city. And then women did not wait for them to come home to get water. And then even women in the Rajput families, in the upper caste families, started going out to collect water. And what they said in the field, and I quote, is "Parda phat gaya," means that the veil has been removed, right? So this is one way in which through occupational diversification, through land use change, gender relations around water were changing. So women who who otherwise did not venture out to collect water now started going out to collect water. So this was one way, through occupational diversification and the migration of men. The second way is through the impacts of the expansion of urban infrastructure. Now, one of the ways that we talk about the peri-urban space is that it bears the ecological footprint of urban expansion. So when I was doing fieldwork in Moderator, in Peri-urban Gurgaon, so initially there was one water treatment plant that was called the Basai water treatment plant that basically met the needs of the city of Gurgaon. But then as the population expanded, a need was felt for the expansion of urban infrastructure. So a second water treatment plant had to be built. And we often read about the Chandu Budhera water treatment plant in the newspaper. And so when this water treatment plant was built, so the grazing lands of the village were acquired. Yeah, and this is sort of, if you look at it from an equity lens, it's in a way paradoxical because Budhera was a highly livestock dependent village. And when this happened, households who needed to maintain their livestock population switched from grazing to stall feeding. Now, in this part of the country, the task of taking the livestock out to graze is a responsibility of men, but collecting fodder and bringing it home is a responsibility of women. So while in Budhera, the task of taking the livestock out to graze was done by men or by professional herders, when households switched to stall feeding, fodder had to be collected and brought home, and that was a responsibility of women. So this was one more way in which women's responsibilities around livestock and fodder collection increased. Now, to an outsider, this may not hit as something very obvious because all that you're doing is you're building a water treatment plant, which seems to be an implicit or a natural response to meeting the water requirements of a growing city. But the way the ecological footprint is born, the way the ecological footprint is experienced is something that catches the attention of those who would look at these kinds of implications from an equity lens, from a gender lens. So this basically represents a case of changing gender relations around livestock and fodder collection. And in a way, it shows how the ecological footprint of urbanization is disproportionately borne by women. And I'd like to mention here that it was lower caste women who were, who bore the impacts much more because in higher caste families, you have the option of growing fodder on your field on private lands. Yes, so that's why I'm saying that the impacts were more acute for lower caste women who were dependent on the grazing lands. Now we know from a number of studies, and N.S. Jodha was one of the pioneers of those studies, which showed that it's the poor households, the small farmers, the landless households that depend much more on the commons. So wherever the commons will be acquired for urban expansion, there will be implications for poor farmers, for small farmers, for landless households. And whenever land use change happens, there are gendered implications, which is what I'm trying to draw attention to here. So this is the second way it happens, through the impacts of the expansion of urban infrastructure. The third way this happens is through the intersection of the forces of land use change and climate change. And here I'm drawing on my research in Mukteshwar. Many of us who come from the north would know that it's a beautiful place. It's a scenic location, and many people like to go there for vacation, as against the neighboring places of Nainital, Almora, which are much more crowded and commercialized. But when I did this field work, Mukteshwar was still pristine, relatively unspoiled, but a lot of land use change was happening there to build tourist resorts and to build weekend getaways of the urban elite. And the lands that were the first to be acquired were the prime lands which were located adjacent to springs. And when this land use change happened, local communities lost access to springs that had historically been managed by them as commons. At the same time, increased competition by tourist resorts, by elitist cottages for groundwater also reduced the availability of water in springs. And so on the one hand, there were these kind of land use changes, increasing competition for water, also reducing the access of local communities to the springs. At the same time, These effects were compounded by increased climatic variability and change. So local narratives pointed to reduced snowmelt and rainfall, which reduced the recharge in spring. So there was again increased drudgery in accessing water. And at the same time, there was also increased drudgery in fodder collection with land use change. And what had happened here was that households had switched from grains to fruits and vegetable cultivation, partly in response to meet the demands of the market, but also in response to changing climatic patterns. And so when you go grow grains, the harvest residue is available to you as a source of fodder. But with the switch from grains to fruits and vegetables, that option was no longer available. And coupled with the cornering of reserve forest, it again made access to fodder much more difficult, right? And so what we found was that women adapted by mobilizing social capital. So for instance, there was norms of reciprocity in fodder collection. So neighboring women would help each other in meeting the requirements of fodder for the respective households. But they also responded by, for instance, walking one way to collect fodder and returning in a shared taxi. But we also found that men and women responded differently to questions on climate change. So when we asked men about climate change, they would have a lot of explanations about why it was happening, what was causing it. When we asked women, they said, "Mujhe kya pata?" Like, what do I know? And we inferred that women were busy adapting to their new roles. They didn't have so much time to engage with what is going on or to articulate it. They didn't have space to articulate it. But they knew that they had to quickly keep responding to their tasks of meeting the requirements for fuel, wood, fodder, and water at home. So these are three ways in which I've drawn on my research to show how gender relations are changing in the peri-urban context. So what are the broader inferences and propositions? So of course, urbanization, land use change intersect with increased climatic variability and change to alter gender relations around natural resources. And this often translates into increased work burdens for women in the fields and at home. Also, what I learned is that of course, gender relations are highly contextual and need to be studied on a blank slate. So it doesn't help to go to the field with preconceived notions of who does what. Yes, intersectionality is important. So for a meaningful analysis of gender, we need to look at how it intersects with other acts of social differentiation like caste. So both in Sultanpur and Budhera, lower caste women faced the highest level of drudgery, the highest level of discrimination in accessing water. And in both the villages, we had found that when a lower caste woman was filling water from a public stand post and she would leave, and the upper caste woman would come, she would first wash the stand post as if it had been made impure by the use of lower caste women. So looking at gender makes sense when you look at it through a lens of intersectionality, looking at it through its intersection with other axes of social differentiation. And as I said, my talk was titled Gender Relations Are Fluid. And as researchers, we must investigate this fluidity. We must try to look at what is it in the peri-urban context that is causing gender relations to change? What is it that's causing gender relations to get transformed, with implications for differential vulnerability of men and women to urbanization, to land use change, whose effects get coupled with increased climatic change and variability. So I hope I'm still within my time. Yes, yeah, and I will just leave with some concluding thoughts. So I want to, say that gender relations in the peri-urban constitute a fertile area for further research and inquiry. So there's possibly much more to be unraveled here, much more to be explored here. And they need more attention in research, policy, and capacity building. And perhaps the discussants may also want to reflect on what might be ways of moving forward on this. And I think that this need has become much more stronger after the pandemic, because peri-urban spaces, because of their very close links with urban areas, looking at how the pandemic has disrupted rural-urban mobility, looking at the enormous presence of the informal sector, in peri-urban spaces, I think that there's much more to be explored here in terms of gender relations, even though the pandemic makes it much more difficult to continue to engage with communities to do what we call a co-creation of knowledge. Yes, and so that's an important challenge to address, I think. How do we continue to create knowledge on the peri-urban after the pandemic, when our opportunities to do field work, to immerse in the context are extremely limited now. I also think that that intervening in the peri-urban requires much more collaboration across academics, researchers, NGOs, and the state. And while formal state planning approaches are necessary, I don't think that they are sufficient. So the assumption that if a peri-urban area would get reclassified as a city, its governance problems will be tackled like a magic wand or like a quick fix, to me is a strong assumption, because it's a very messy space, a lot of biodiversity of actors, a very strong presence of non-statutory mechanisms of resource allocation, which need to be understood. So I think that we need more action research, more collaboration between the state, local governments, researchers, and NGOs. And also, I think more men should study and talk about gender. So gender is not just about women; it's about the differences between men and women. And I often find myself on a gender panel where I happen to be the only man, and luckily that's not the case today. So I was very happy to see a good gender balance in the composition of the. So if you look at the speaker, the moderator, and the discussants together, there was a very good gender balance. So to me, that was a very heartening. That was very heartening to note, because otherwise I'm very often the only man talking about gender in an all-woman panel. So I think that more men should talk about gender, because if you want gender transformative change, then both men and women have to be part of it, and not just women doing advocacy for protecting women's rights. So on that note, I would stop, and thank you for the opportunity, and hand you over back to the chair, to Dr. Chattopadhyay.
So thank you, Professor Narain, for an exciting talk. It's really wonderful to hear from you. So there are many important takeaways from your talk. First, quite rightly, because those who are not very much familiar with this very idea of these peri-urban areas, you have rightly problematized the very definition of these peri-urban areas as a geographical, rather than a geographical place of demarcated areas, rather you define it as a place for transition. And also you wonderfully deconstructed this very concept of vulnerability and its gendered nature in terms of, you mentioned about the division of labor, then the adaptive capacity in terms of differential access to natural and financial resources, the sensitivity, and then also you argued about how the changes in these land use pattern, this migration, occupational diversification, all have some gender implications in the peri-urban areas. And what I find it very interesting is this example of where you have shown that how this appropriation of common for the expansion of this urban infrastructure has some very interesting gender implication, and which has also intersected with the caste issues. So these are very interesting topic. And also you mentioned about the higher inclination among the women for adapting to the climate change. All these having some greater implications for the gender related research on the peri-urban areas. So it's a wonderful talk, and I'm sure that many of our discussions will shed some more lights into this topic. So now let me open this floor for our discussion. So let us start with Dr. Ramakrishna Nallathiga, who is an associate professor at the National Institute of Construction Management and Research, Pune. So it's over to you, Dr. Nallathiga.
Yeah, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
first of all, thanks for this opportunity to interact. I know I read Professor Narain's articles, particularly in the context of water resources, in the context of Hyderabad, where he has collaborated and worked with in the context of Anjal Prakash about how the various processes are leading to in the peripheral areas of Hyderabad and few other cities are leading to the resource issues, be it groundwater or even surface water in terms of the lake water access issues which were emerging. But of course, gender is not my area of interest or research as such. But I would like to bring about some kind of precursors to perhaps gender in the form of one way we think about looking in a positive or progressive way about the gender is that like how do we mainstream the gender into the formal planning processes. So one thing is that like that's where there is a lot of thinking about from the planning circles where I'm talking about the urban planning and the spatial planning people who say that like much of this kind of peri-urban areas or peri-urban growth and peri-urban development is happening in the fringe areas is because of the shortcomings on the part of the planning system, which is not properly understood, particularly in the developing countries context. Particularly our planning apparatus, which is built upon the colonial planning apparatus, which have not really innovated much, is giving rise to a wide disparity in the way in which the plans are made and the reality is. Essentially, our plans are very, very incremental in nature, and the kind of standards we set when it comes to the planning are also very, very impractical, that are not even that are perhaps appropriate for the developed countries, but not for the developing countries. In fact, in some of the standards, actually, our standards are even much more than the developed country standards. For example, the water supply is a very good example. So whether the planning itself is a kind of a failure in that as an institution is one thing which comes to my mind. And second is that like whether the planning, even if it were able to take care of by its processes to deliver the services as well as develop the formal spaces, still what happens is that like because most of the planning confines to the formal city, and beyond the formal city, which is the declared urban, it really doesn't go beyond planning, whereas that is where actually you need the planning. So our planners are perhaps should have been looking not only to the core area, but rather should have been planning more on the peripheries. But we see that like more and more resources and planning efforts are made to the central cities, which already have resources and plans, and therefore the gendering is already taking place in those areas, whereas peripheral areas are the places where the planning is a failure and planning is not done. And one of the ways in some of the countries have taken care is by the way of the regional plans, like in the UK. So which try to address the concerns which are not addressed by the planning in the city boundaries by the way of some kind of regional plans, so that like these will accommodate the services, the spaces, and a formal development processes to be put in place, which is somewhat absent in our country, other than few cities like Mumbai and to some extent Delhi. Very few cities have got any kind of regional plans or planning bodies as such. So that is one lacunae in our planning system. And the other is that like criticism that comes about the planning institutions is that like even if they are there is the institutional capacity is sometimes poor, in the sense that like the amount of staff, be it staffing related or even the technical capacities of the staff itself is somewhat limited. And again, it is most of the time it is state government led planning rather than the planning done by the regions or the cities in the peripheral areas as such. So that is all this is compounding into the manifestation of this kind of peripheral areas, which are deprived of the kind of the planned developed spaces and planned civic services, and therefore along with that, once these are in place, the assumption, of course, it not to be valid, is that the development, the economic development processes will start working, and the gendering or mainstreaming of the gender can happen. So that's where I thought I would like to bring an attention to this, and if it is this kind of shortcoming which is there in the planning and service delivery, what are the views on overcoming them, some of them, or what are your views on that as such, I thought.
Thank you, Dr. Nallathiga, for drawing our attention to this problem of lack of planning, or broadly I can say that governance deficits, which ultimately shapes this the access to infrastructure. And I'm sure that Professor Narain has already mentioned about the gendered access to the differential access to the infrastructural services in the different study areas. So definitely these are very important issues, and I'm sure Dr. Narain will be touching upon all these issues while in responding to your comments. Now let me move over to Dr. Divya Gupta, who is a senior research fellow at Bharti Institute of Public Policy at the Indian School of Business. So it's over to you, Dr. Divya.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Narain, for such an enlightening talk. And thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for organizing and moderating. I honestly have been learning so much through these interactions. For all these years, I've worked mostly in the rural context. And through my experience of working in the rural context in India and now also in Nepal, what I'm starting to become more curious about is this peri-urban space, because there is, as Dr. Narain mentioned, these urban areas are expanding, and they're expanding into the rural space. And there's this really interesting space of peri-urban areas that are also expanding. So initially the boundaries got fuzzy, and then now those areas are becoming wider, and there are a lot of interesting interactions that are happening in those transitioning spaces. And I've been thinking about this, and it's really the talk happened in a very timely manner, because currently, Dr. Narain, I'm working in Kangra in Himachal, and in this research, I'm mostly looking at the impact of people's interaction or the dependence on the forest at the time of the pandemic. And now Kangra is really interesting because it's the region where we are working, especially our sites very close to Dharamshala and McLeodganj. And you can't compare them to these traditional cities like Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore, but they have over time, these areas, Dharamshala and McLeodganj, because of the tourist attraction, they have expanded in the sense that there are these resorts, and this is something which is very typical in a lot of northeastern areas like Mukteshwar that you just mentioned, that although they are not they do not fit the definition of urban or the cities, yet there are these activities or infrastructure expansion that are happening, and unfortunately these areas, they cannot accommodate that kind of infrastructure expansion, yet they're happening. And then the expansion is spilling over onto other neighboring regions. So the area where I'm working, so this is my first time working in Kangra region. And the moment I enter Kangra in Palampur, so a lot of our sites are around Palampur area, what really strikes is these concrete structures. Panchayats, I see that how even the lifestyles of people, they're changing. It's changing from those kacha house, from the mud houses to more concrete house. So I see that lifestyle also changing. So in that context, in that transitioning context, I'm trying to understand how people's interaction with the forest changed at the time of pandemic. And what has been really interesting, I'm still at the very preliminary stage. And what has been really interesting for me is to see that we've conducted over 150 interviews so far. And across the board, people have mentioned that how their dependence has decreased or the dependence went down, especially at the time of the lockdown. And when we were thinking about as to what could be the reason, and then keeping the context in mind, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I still have to validate, and as a panel, we can all reflect on it. So one of the ideas that I've been thinking about is that the shock of the pandemic, I mean, people had been in this process of transitioning, but the shock of the pandemic, it pushed them further to take that call that, we have to do something to secure our livelihoods. And it's kind of pushing them away from the traditional rural lifestyles and the rural livelihoods. And this is again really interesting because there is this dominant paradigm of how the rural communities should be, and then they're dependent on the natural resources and things like that. But then when we use this lens of peri-urban area, it creates a very unique picture altogether. And I think that is something, I wouldn't call it novel. I mean, we all are aware of it. It exists out there. But I think somehow, the attention, the scholarly attention especially, has not been given to this a lot. And oftentimes, we fall into that trap of, oh yes, natural resource dependence has increased, and these are rural communities. And really, this context, especially, using the lens of peri-urban, and even the expansion and spilling over of the urban expansion into, or the infrastructure expansion to rural areas, and how that impacts the people's dependence on natural resources has been really interesting. So it's amazing. I wanted to mention that how timely this talk happened, and it resonated a lot with me. What I hadn't been thinking about is this gender lens. And I very much agree. Even in my research, I'm seeing that although yes, the lifestyles are changing and people are opting for more urban lifestyles and kind of moving away from the rural lifestyles, yet there is this really stark divide. I mean, there are very impoverished communities or households that are still struggling to have their ends meet, and I think in the context of peri-urban area, it becomes even harder. The divide, that socioeconomic divide, it's it's more prominent. So clearly, we are seeing that the impoverished communities, especially in the context of shock in the peri-urban areas, they are affected the most. But then this aspect of gender, it makes it even more interesting, because even within the impoverished communities, the gender are furthermore, I feel they're more vulnerable, and they need further deconstruction and further sort of we need to explore that more. But I was thinking that I don't want to be hopeless, and I want to still find ways, if there are opportunities for these marginalized and for these vulnerable communities. So I'm actually I would pose it as a question, in a form of a question to the panel, that yes, there are these vulnerabilities and gendered vulnerabilities in peri-urban area, and these vulnerabilities get even worse or exacerbated in the context of shocks like the pandemic. But then I'm wondering if there are opportunities for resilience, if there are opportunities for further empowering these vulnerable communities. Because again, in the context of pandemic, what we are studying, that yes, I mean, it's an unprecedented event and has caused major disruption, but then there are also some opportunities. And I'm not trying to undermine the disruption and the damage and the huge loss that has happened due to the pandemic, but I'm also wondering, I'm being as realistic as possible, because hope is all that we have, that what possibly can be the opportunities to enable, given the context, to enable these vulnerable communities, especially the women, to bounce back from the shock.
So thank you, Dr. Divya, for sharing your thoughts. And just to add to it, because I was also thinking in the same way, since Dr. Narain has already mentioned in his talk about the role that the women take in occupational diversification and then on all these economic activities. So what about the impact of such gendered kind of practices on their empowerment? Because this is a very crucial issues in the context of peri-urban areas. And since they are now being more and more engaged in different forms of activities, there are different, even in the case of access to infrastructural services, they are now taking the burden of all doing all these things. So what about the empowermental implications, along with the important point which you have already mentioned about the resilience? So I'm sure that Dr. Narain will enlighten us on all these issues. And now let me proceed to Dr. Meenakshi Sinha, who is a postdoctoral fellow of Applied Social Sciences at Banaras Hindu University. So it's over to you, Dr. Meenakshi.
Hi, just to mention, I've joined with a private consultancy. I was at VHO a few months back.
Oh, okay, that's
I'm just another contract at IHS.
Okay.
Doesn't matter, it was just like a short while back, so I think that was anyway. Okay. Professor Narayan, first of all, thank you to you for this very nice talk. And although I work in the sphere of urban planning, including peri-urban, but gender is one lens which I haven't taken a look. I have just few comments, and probably I think whatever you've said is just add on to it. I won't restrict you. One was you mentioned about the sites which you had taken into account. One was the Gurgaon, and the other was Mukteshwar. So Mukteshwar, when you brought up the land use change, is another aspect how that changed the gender transition between the gender space. I was just curious about a few things. If you could hear more about what happened in Gurgaon. See, I'm assuming, I'm not familiar with the sites in Mukteshwar. Gurgaon is likely to be different from the hilly areas of Kumaon for many reasons. See, this is the kind of zone, I don't know how Mukteshwar would look like. I'm assuming it's some sort of hilly area. It's largely dependent. There is lesser sort of industrial opportunities to both. So it's less available to men, it's less available to women. And then Gurgaon, again, coming back to Delhi NCR, will have more occupational opportunities, kind of economic inequality, housing. So how do all those factors play into this kind of work? What are the differences there? So that was one thing I think I would just urge. I mean, I think probably some other people also would want to work in this area further. And the other thing I probably wanted to take you back to was urban infrastructure, which you've already mentioned. See, again, in terms of the kind of spatial planning, transportation, all of that, housing communities, and even across classes, the interactions with infrastructure systems provide opportunities for mitigation as well as sort of take away certain opportunities. See, and how do these change during the pandemic? I'll just give you one example. So during the pandemic, see, probably in Mukteshwar, I'm assuming a lot of women, they're dependent on forest and for all those things. Those opportunities, I mean, are unlikely to be taken away by lockdown. Or maybe I don't know how restrictions are going to play out there. But say women working in households and say in communities, and especially the lower income groups interacting with the higher income groups in housing communities of Gurgaon, they will be employed as household maids or whatever. I don't know how, in what capacity. Also, they must be interacting the upper class communities here. So, and this is largely the section which is an informal sector. So, can some way, I mean, if we have the dynamic equations, like how did these things play out during the pandemic? Did the employers give them money, or there was any backup, or they had to diversify, or our infrastructure? I'm sure during the pandemic, some sort of restriction must be played on how they were commuting, public buses and all those things. I'm just thinking in terms of economics, what was going on, and if those other threats which can be brought out or can be researched more, what can the public system or the government where can we intervene to mitigate those challenges? So these are some of the questions which I had, and probably I'm just putting you a bit further in this. But again, the lens was refreshing. There's nothing, I won't say it was there. I mean, whatever I'm saying, you're just adding on and probably taking it a bit further, whatever you've already done. But anyway, very nice. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sinha. In fact, like you, I think most of us are all in, have lots of questions, because this gendered list is so unique in the context of peri-urban areas. So yeah, you have rightly pointed out two specific questions. So I'm sure that Dr. Narayan will respond to your questions during his responses. Well, so after that, let me now move over to Dr. Jenia Mukherjee, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Kharagpur. So may I now request Dr. Jenia to share her comments. It's over to you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, Pramodip sir, and thank you, IMPRI, for giving me this opportunity, because I have to confess that I am a big admirer of Vishal Narain sir's works. And since the days when I was actually doing my PhD, and also I came in touch with Adriana Allen, and I think Adriana, she's like one of the maybe propounders of this peri-urban or peri-urbanization. And honestly, like when I was working on the East Kolkata wetlands and East Kolkata wetlands, that time, like some scientists and even like in media projection, East Kolkata wetlands was like a kind of designated or considered as peri-urban wetlands, and there was a whole lot of human cry that that whether it is right to try to delineate East Kolkata wetlands as peri-urban or not. Because like historians, for example, and I remember like one of my professors, Sudeshna Banerjee, and she has also one publication which came out in 2012 in the South Asia Chronicle, and she showed that when and as experts or scholars are trying to designate these wetlands as peripheral or peri-urban wetlands, so there is a larger politics in this, because they don't want to consider this as part of the larger frontier or geo-ecomorphological dynamics of the delta. So like very interesting like discussions and criticisms, debates, dialogue going on that time. And then like I think for 10 to 12 years I had spent thinking about whether this PKW should be considered peri-urban or not. And then finally I tried to tackle it in my book. So I think Narain said definitely, and also like his articles with Sumit Vij. So I think, they are wonderful articles, and I felt all the time like I went through those articles. They were extremely like empirically also, they were very, very rich. So, and today's presentation also like I found very informative. And sir also mentioned about place-based, why place-based narratives and situatedness, they provide importance, they can be considered as important perspectives or frames of analysis. So I think my very small comment would be, because like in urban political ecology, we already have this situated urban political ecology now. So like, very young scholars like Alex Follman or Natasha Cornia or NICMAR, they are talking about situatedness, because I think all of us got quite provoked with Lawhorn and Arnstein's provincializing urban political ecology. So and in our own empirical context, we started talking about situatedness, why it is important to basically concentrate on micro-political specificities and settings. And similarly, like for example, Natasha and Anna Zimmer, they edited this special issue which came out in Samaj, and Yafa Chula. So Yafa has worked, or Yafa is still working on Delhi and also outskirts of Delhi. And Yafa, very interestingly, she talks about this intra-space inequities. So it's not only the inter-spatial inequities, but it's also like intra-spatial inequities. And she also talks about these intersections across caste, gender, ethnicity, class. So why these intersections are so very important. And I think this topic, it is still quite less focused. So for example, the empirical findings that sir shared with us in his presentation, so I think they are very provocative, in the sense that like we are getting here everything together. And now, I was just repenting, because I got the opportunity in 2015 to work with Adriana, where we were actually looking into, or we were mapping the water context in peri-urban Kolkata. So again, this Kolkata wetlands was part of the study, but other parts of Kolkata as well, other parts of peri-urban Kolkata. And when we when we are kind of mapping this water justice or injustice situation, we were kind of documenting the array of bottom-up needs-driven practices or strategies that are there, or that which are pursued and practiced by marginalized people in those patches, because there is an inadequacy in policy-driven initiatives. But unfortunately, we did not take gender as an important notion of analysis, unfortunately. But now, after listening to Sir's lecture, and also, of course, peri-urbanization is something which is so very important. So I think now this this presentation was providing a whole lot of insights about why should we include gender or accommodate gender into the discussion. And it can absolutely be just juxtaposed, into the discussion, and I mean, a whole lot of fresh insights can get unfurled. So finally, also another very interesting study, so which one of my scholar is actually conducting as part of his PhD. So he is concentrating on the solid waste management mechanisms or practices in the small towns in the periphery of Kolkata. So there's this Hooghly stretch, all these colonial towns, and this stretch is also quite interesting because this is called mini Europe. Because, for example, Chandanagar was colonized by the French, then Srirampur by the Dutch. So we really have mini Europe there. So so he, coming from a quantitative background, so he deployed what is known as IPA, Importance Performance Analysis. So it's a very typical method, of boring, of course. People who don't like numbers a lot, they will criticize this framework. But anyway, but what he could find out, it's quite interesting that women. So when the scores, so now when he has been able to kind of release the scores, IP assessment, when the IP assessment has been complete, it's quite interesting to find out that women, they seem to be very active participants in terms of not only giving due weightage or importance to various components of solid waste management, but also performing those out. And in the three small towns, which is a part of his study area, I mean, the performance of women is much better than their male counterparts. So now in his conclusion is trying to kind of come up with policy recommendations that, and I think this can be an interesting piece of study, because it enables us to imagine women not only as passive spectators or victims, but also coping actors and adaptive managers and agents. So I think, thank you very much, sir. And the last and final comment is, I think I came across a report. It's a very small report in this but this is called CGKN, Climate and Development Knowledge Network. So in their platform, I came across a report where they actually talked about an environmental action group. I think Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, who have, and these members of the Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, they have worked with the local communities. And of course, gender, they have given a whole lot of weightage to this gender question. And because, these local communities, many of them are also women. So there are opportunities, or there are discussions now through which they are talking of kind of climate compatible, gender sensitive forms of development. So my question to sir is that, would you like to also shed a bit of light on, how can we mobilize, or rather how academicians can get mobilized with this, grassroots organizations or this action groups, because it is, I think, important for us to not only pursue transdisciplinary research, but also, how can we forge a transsectoral engagement? Because otherwise, discussing gender would not make much sense.
So thank you, Dr. Jenia, for your very insightful comments. Now, I think we have another discussion, Mr. Samir Unhale, but he is not there. I'm not seeing him. So let's move over to Dr. Narain for your responses, comments, observations to the points which have our discussions raised.
Okay, thank you. So very overwhelming to see so much interest on the peri-urban and also on gender. And of course, I don't have definitive answers to all of the questions, but just, I mean, I could connect with most of the points that were raised because I also encountered them in my own work and my own research. And I'll just share some thoughts and reflection, and maybe then other panelists may also have further thoughts on them, and then we can get back to them. So starting with Dr. Nallathiga. So, the problem about planning and how the peri-urban is the result of some kind of an unplanned urban expansion and how there is a neglect at the periphery. So that is true. And that's the way that's the way the peri-urban has been problematized, that it's a space of institutional neglect, that it's a space of state apathy. And so at the same time, as I said, that to assume that a formal planned approach, for instance, by bringing them under some kind of a statutory governance authority or body will solve the problems is also, to my mind, a strong assumption, because it's a very messy space. It's not something that you can, from what I've understood, it's not something that you can directly intervene through a command and control mechanism or through a new kind of a, planning body, which is not to say that that is not important. But I think that till that happens, there's a lot of potential for getting, say, people who live in such spaces into dialogue with the state. So, for instance, one of our projects, which was an action research project, we had organized a series of meetings between in Sultanpur village, which I spoke about, a series of meetings between the residents of Sultanpur and the PHED, the Public Health Engineering Department that provides water. So when we started work in Sultanpur, they said that, that we have poor water supply from the PHED, they're not accountable. And we figured out that one of the problem was lack of communication or mutual accountability between the residents of Sultanpur and the PHED. So as part of the action research project that was supported by IDRC Canada, we got the residents of community into dialogue with the PHED. So I think that is one way of intervening. So getting peri-urban communities into dialogue with state agencies and getting the state to be more responsive to them. So that is one way to fill in what we call the institutional neglect, the institutional void, and that's something where academics, NGOs, and CSOs, have a role to play. So I think that was one. The other thing is that there is a, so conceptually the words governance and government mean two different things. So there is an absence of government maybe in the peri-urban in the sense of a formal regularized state approach to regulating the problems, but there are governance mechanisms there, just that, but they're in the non-statutory sphere. So there are informal mechanisms of resource allocation, resource sharing, and difficult as it may seem, I think those need to be understood before we intervene. Otherwise, we may end up creating redundant governance structures. We may end up creating conflicting situations where with contestation of the same set of natural resources. So what I want to argue is that maybe the mechanisms of resource allocation in the peri-urban need to be better researched and documented. And the other response to Dr. Nallathiga is that, yes, while the lack of planning is an important issue, bringing everything under a planned approach will take time. But in the meanwhile, there's a lot of scope to just get peri-urban communities into dialogue with state agencies, build civic engagement, the way we use that term, and get them to get state to respond more effectively to people who live in such spaces. So on Dr. Divya Gupta's comments. So yes, so talking about McLeodganj and Dharamshala. So that's a different kind of peri-urban. That's not like the Chennai, Hyderabad, Gurgaon kind of peri-urban where there's special economic zones, IT and real estate causing land use change. But in the literature, that kind of a land use change is what we call amenity-led migration. So it's a term that we use where the movement of people for the aesthetic value of the place. Yeah, and that was also the case of Mukteshwar. It was the case of amenity-led migration. And for McLeodman and Dharamshala, maybe the spiritual value is there because of being the home of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So a lot of people will go there to see for the spiritual value. And yes, I've been there too, and there are hotels and resorts. So it's a similar process to Mukteshwar, where the land use change is driven by the aesthetic value or by the spiritual value of the place. Yes. So what can we do? Now, the thing is that one way to intervene in the peri-urban is to mobilize peri-urban communities. And if you want to work with women, that's also one way. So for instance, to mobilize community into collective groups. Yes, but there's a lot of literature which shows the kind of constraints that women face in being part of collective groups. Yes. And a lot of literature talks about what we call nominal participation. So you may have formal groups, they reserve seats for women, but then they're represented by men or by elderly male relatives. So maybe then the way out is to have all women groups, all female groups, yes, and mobilize them to look at how they can collectively address the challenges that are coming forth. Yeah, but of course, forest is an area where gender dimensions are very relevant, very pronounced, and worth investigating. Like you said. So I think that was what I would like to say in response to Divya's questions. For Dr. Meenakshi Sinha, so one of the questions was, how are the contexts of Gurgaon and Mukteshwar different? So they were actually part of two very different research projects. And the only reason I brought them together in this talk was that they were interesting insights on the topic of gender. And that's why I brought them here. But yes, Gurgaon's peri-urban is very different from Mukteshwar's peri-urban. So Gurgaon has a phenomenon of land use change that's been driven mainly by real estate, by the outsourcing industry, by proposals to set up special economic zones. And Mukteshwar's Mukteshwar is a different kind of peri-urban. It's mainly about a land use change driven by the aesthetic value of the place. Yes, so in that sense, there are two different cases. And of course, Mukteshwar was also less socially heterogeneous than the research sites in Gurgaon. Yeah, and the questions, so all this research that I presented was the pre-pandemic research. In fact, most of it has already been published and I cited them. But yes, as I said, that the pandemic provides new opportunities to unravel how the gender divides have deepened in peri-urban spaces. And I don't have any direct insights on that yet to formal research, except to say that, for instance, if you look at a place like Gurgaon, these little rural pockets, rural settlements that are still intact within the city are in many ways the backbone of the city, in the sense that a lot of the supporting services of housemaids, of drivers, of car cleaners, of security guards come from these little rural settlements, these little pockets of rural settlements located within and adjacent to within the city and adjacent to high-rise gated communities. And a lot of disruption of economic activity would have happened there. And the second thing is that, as I said, that peri-urban spaces depend very strongly on their links with the city for supplies of goods, services, for movements of labor, for raw material, for markets of agricultural produce. And one of the things worth investigating would have been, with the disruption of these rural-urban links, how are those livelihoods affected? So a lot of research on the peri-urban talks about the rural-urban mobility, talks about the diversity in the means of transport between rural and urban areas, and especially in the first wave of the lockdown, when the lockdown was rather abrupt, was sudden and abrupt, with a sudden disruption of mobility, then that's one very important area to investigate, how the disruption of the rural-urban links in the midst of the lockdown and the pandemic affected peri-urban livelihoods, and then what would be the gendered implications of that. So what I found was that there's a gender-based division of labor in the household, which reproduced itself at the farm, right? So in Mukteshwar, for instance, women do a lot the on-farm work. Yes, but carrying the produce to the market, taking the produce to the market is the prerogative of the man. So there's a gender-based division of labor of the household, which in a way reproduces outside the household and governs, the household's external interactions and relations. Yeah, on Dr. Julia Mukherjee, yes, so first of all, thanks for the nice words on the work, on the papers that you've read. And yes, so wetlands are peri-urban in many ways, in the sense that I see them as a case of a common that defies a clear rural-urban classification. So we started thinking of, we started our work on the commons, for instance, Ostrom and others, looking at commons as very agrarian, commons in very agrarian context. So, irrigation systems, pastures, grazing lands. But the growing nature of the city means that the rural and urban boundaries are blurring. And therefore, this kind of a dichotomy of commons, is a rural common or an urban common, becomes less relevant. And wetlands are, like I've done some work on the Deepor Beel, in Guwahati in the northeast, which has very similar challenges. So the encroachment along the Beel, the shrinkage of its area, the dumping of waste. So the wetlands are, to my mind, a very important context to study this kind of peri-urbanity, to understand how the rural-urban dichotomy in classifying commons is no longer relevant. So I think that is what I would say. But also, I think for those of us who are in academics and who work with students or who supervise master's dissertations, doctoral research, I think there's an opportunity to encourage students and scholars to look at questions of gender. But as I said, gender is one axis of social differentiation that intersects with many others. So I think for those of us in academics, in research, there is an opportunity to encourage students and scholars to engage with these questions, to look at questions of equity and access and changing and the implications of rapid urban expansion for changing differential access to resources among different sections of society. So I think that's what I would like to say here. Yes. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Narain, for your elaborate comments on all the discussions, responses. And I'm just seeing Mr. Samir Unhale is with us. He is the Joint Commissioner, Directorate of Municipal Administration, Government of Maharashtra. So it's over to you, Mr. Unhale, for your comments.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to interact. Looking at the borders of rural and urban, we find three kind of situation that we face in day-to-day functioning. One, of course, are the transitory areas, which are beyond 10,000 population, and as per the state statute is concerned, they ought to be made into a transitory urban area, the Nagar Panchayat. Second, of course, are the urban villages, which especially more so in the metropolitan regions. And third, of course, is the peri-urban area, which deals about the administrative borders between the so-called municipal or statutory urban area and the non-urban area, which normally is a rural area. So as was rightly mentioned, there is no vacuum as such in the peri-urban area as far as the governance is concerned, especially in at least in the state of Maharashtra. I can definitely vouch that every habitat which is in the peri-urban area is very much under a rural administration local body framework. It will be either a Gram Panchayat, as we call it here in Maharashtra, or a group Gram Panchayat. And therefore, the peri-urban area is very much within the general rural local body framework of the state. And therefore, these areas are definitely catered by the government framework, the local government framework. Secondly, I think as far as the access of gender is concerned and the gender vulnerabilities is concerned, in these peri-urban areas, I think it will be a strange, it will be rather a curious mix actually, because traditionally the rural local bodies are much more stronger institutionally, funding-wise and manpower-wise to deal on the social welfare administration that would include health, education, and the welfare administration of the SC, ST and OBCs and women. So somehow there is a feeling that the primacy of rural local bodies into peri-urban areas normally tends to have a greater or a stronger administration vis-a-vis gender perspectives as compared to urban area, which tends to be more engineering centric, it is more technology centric, and it relies more and more on the private sector really to look for the usual welfare issues like health and education, and even to an extent gender for that matter. That would be a bit curious mix, but the urban areas are yet to take up in my view, many of them are yet to take up institutionally be strong by manpower wise, by processes wise, by funding wise, regarding taking care of the gender sensibilities in the usual governance functioning. Because all said and done, the inavailability of primacy of engineering and technology in cities is there. And that was just a second observation I felt I should be sharing. Third, of course, is the peculiarities of women staying in the peri-urban area. In a sense that aspirationally, the woman would be, of course, looking more and more towards the urban sensibilities culturally as to maybe greater access, greater education, greater mobility, greater ascertance into the normal social life. Culturally speaking, however, the social norms of a rural area are not entirely like that of maybe a big urban area. As was rightly mentioned, I was of course probably comparing more with million plus city regions or urban areas like that too within Western Maharashtra or Western India for that matter. So what I'm saying probably may not have much relevance into pan-India level. However, this culturally there is this tug of war really goes on where the woman would be fighting a girl child or maybe a college going woman, a young adult, someone who is working, making newly into family. It goes to this cultural and psychological tug of war between the existing social conditions that exist in a peri-urban area and what sometimes she really looks up to and aspires for into what actually goes around with her, because traveling into a core of a mega city region or a city or a million plus city region is not a problem. Mobility is always there. So probably this tug of war at psychological and cultural level is very much a factor actually that needs to be catered for. And fourthly, I would like to just share some views upon the governance part, the hardcore administration part. That really goes. As was mentioned earlier in one of the webinars of the IMPRI, I think I remember, there was issues raised regarding the fund flow from the provincial or from the state government, and as well as from the central funding mechanisms to the peri-urban area is mostly as the norms of rural. So the funding, I think there is staff of funding in all the aspects of administration is concerned as compared to the urban area, because in fact even in the 15th Finance Commission we are seeing that the fund flow which is going for the million plus area goes into the urban the lead urban city of that part, and that goes mostly to municipal bodies, and probably something has to be thought as on additional funding patterns for the peri-urban area is also important. And fifthly, of course, I felt that it has become a cliche now that everything functions in silos, not only within a organization but within the area also. There's a lot of intersectoral functioning is happening, and maybe two examples that could be shared. One as to how the rural-urban dichotomy needs to be a bit diluted, and probably we could have more flexible and more matrix form of flexi structures which could take care of the administrative and governance issues. Maybe, in fact, as far as the town planning part is concerned in the state of Maharashtra, I could share that the urban norms are extended up to 15 kilometers into the peri-urban area. So whatever regulation, development and control regulations are there of urban area, they are also extended even to peri-urban areas by 15 kilometers. That is a general semblance which is being done. So there is no planning vacuum as such. As far as the peri-urban area is concerned, development is concerned. Similarly, for infrastructure, providing of infrastructure, maybe water supply, maybe there have been, in fact, the earlier place which I had worked, if there is just a road across the administrative border and of urban and a rural part. I mean, it was just a road in which the other side of the road was a Gram Panchayat. It was as neighborly as that. And in this case, it did happen that the usual civic services issues, which otherwise may not be that strongly in other rural part, are quite strong, and therefore some mechanism has to be developed, and therefore the Act does talk of collaboration between the various local bodies. So the provision is there. There is a provision of cooperation and collaboration between various units of the urban or the rural body, and that can be probably made more stronger. One example we have here is a combined water supply scheme. The regional water supply schemes is a common phenomenon now in many parts. However, in fact, even in Mumbai region, there is a company actually called as the STEM Authority, which takes care of the water supply scheme of the urban as well as the rural peri-urban area also. So these are various examples, which could be tried of. And lastly, which was very rightly mentioned, was the solid waste management issue. In fact, wherever I have worked in urban areas, there have been discord and maybe mild clashes regarding solid waste management, where the solid waste of the city is to be put somewhere, and normally it lands up into a peri-urban area or a village, and that does create a issue. And frankly speaking, despite many projects, this issue has not entirely been solved. I haven't seen to be entirely solved. There have been, slight tailoring here and there, maybe political discussions, compromises, maybe certain, developmental works given as incentives to take the filth of the city. But yes, I think that as far as this providing civic services, providing infrastructure services into peri-urban area probably requires faster rethinking, because the way cities and the way urban areas respond and the way rural hierarchy, as we know. In India, the rural local body system, especially, we had it's also 50, 70 years old now, after the famous Balwant Rai Mehta committee and the Ashok Mehta committee, which dwelt upon the structure of the rural urban local bodies, focusing on democratic decentralization. And I think it's almost a lot of time has gone. And as was mentioned, probably the dichotomy framework of rural-urban needs to be probably made more flexible, and greater cooperation within the local bodies, the political structure, and as well as the joint bodies or joint companies or joint departments of the peri-urban and urban could be tried out, because the political significance of peri-urban areas is not very small. In fact, I have seen cities getting expanded once, twice, thrice, 4 times of the peri-urban area, which it's like a black hole sucking more and more matter. So the big city region keeps on sucking more and more peri-urban areas into its administrative framework, and ultimately making unwieldy to manage. So a lot of there's such thoughts are being now discussed, that is there an optimal size of a peri-urban area? In Indian context, we really don't have any metropolitan governance framework as of now. We may be having a land use planning or infrastructure providing framework, but a metropolitan governance framework is still absent in Indian context. Maybe the example often comes out of Paris, in which, or even London for that matter, where a 3-tier system can somewhere be available. So I think there is a lot of scope and a lot of need of collaboration between academic, between media, between research and administration, really to find out what are the to find out scientifically as to what are the ways of, what are the framing the issue itself as well as finding the causes of that, because mere reliance on so-called experience is often found to be not accurate in depiction of the reality. So I think I'm sure other countries, other parts of the world might also be facing a different kind of challenges. When we talk of urbanization, it's essentially now global south. It will be Asia, it will be Africa, it will be Latin America, and what predictions or patterns that we are expecting. I think there will be a lot to share, a lot to learn, and maybe some ideas, some framework of institutionalizing this cooperation in a easily accessible way to everybody is also a need of the hour, which could be thought of. So I think, sir, I think I probably exceeded my time limit. So it was great to listen, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nale. It's over to Professor Narain for the responses. But before that, I'm seeing another one question in the Q&A box, and it is partly related to the larger issues of governing these peri-urban areas. Who will govern the peri-urban areas? But as second part, I think you may like to highlight, or you may like to comment, like what is the role of these governing structure in as far as the creation of opportunities are concerned to reduce the kind of gendered inequalities that you talked about in your presentation. So it's over to you, Professor Narain.
Right. Okay. So just some quick responses to the last discussant. So yeah, so as you said, I agree. So it's not that there is a governance lacuna in that sense, because what you call peri-urban would typically be a village, at the cusp of a city or being transformed, through the interface with the city, but it will pretty much have its own village panchayat. So all the village, all the sites that I spoke about today had functioning village panchayats. But the issue, I think, is about looking at like the challenge is in looking at issues which cut across the rural-urban jurisdiction. So, for instance, if you think of urban wastewater, coming into the villages and being used for irrigation, yes, so that's one. Or if you think of the relocation of polluting industries from the city core to the periphery, yes. So it is not that there is no governance structure in place. So there will be a village panchayat. So in Gurgaon, there are many, say, rural settlement areas within the jurisdiction of the city that are now officially under the Municipal Corporation of Gurgaon. So you will see a board that says Village Wazirabad Municipal Corporation of Gurgaon, or you'll say Village Tigra Municipal Corporation of Gurgaon. But the governance challenge maybe there is that while the older governance structure, like the panchayat, has ceased to exist, maybe the new governance structure has not completely taken over or is not completely functional. So I think it is these kinds of issues that we need to address. I think also one area where we need to intervene is how is in our education and training and capacity building. So when we train urban planners, so we have institutes that train urban planners, we have institutes that train rural development professionals. Yes, so maybe I think this overcoming of this rural-urban dichotomy needs to start at that stage. So how do we train urban planners that don't look at that don't look at the city outside the rural context? So how do we train urban planners that understand the implications of the urban expansion of the city, or who understand the implications of the expansion of the city for the rural area? So I think I think a lot of possibility and opportunities for reform in curriculum when we train what we call urban planners, urban professionals, or when we train rural development specialists, to encourage them to look at the relationship between the rural and the urban, rather than to position themselves as urban planners or as rural development specialists. So I think that is one. The other thing is also training and capacity building of existing professionals. So getting urban planners, training them to look at the peri-urban, to understand the peri-urban issues, to talk about gender, to talk about the impacts of urbanization on natural resources. So I think training and capacity building is important. And this also relates to a comment that Jania raised a little while ago, like how should academics interact with other actors? And I think that in academics we concentrate a lot on scientific publishing, on writing articles in peer-reviewed journals, which is important for academic credibility and recognition. But also, I think as academics, we need to reach out to different kinds of audiences, also communicate with different kinds of audiences. So, and that's where maybe writing policy briefs or writing short opinion pieces in the newspaper that allow us to communicate with a larger group of actors, outside the academic community is important. So doing policy briefs, writing editorial pieces, writing popular articles. These is, of course, a lot of opportunities on social media. So I think that's an important role to play in terms of creating a public opinion, in terms of informing public opinion, to think about the peri-urban, I think that is what I would say. Again, these are not definitive, but these are just some thoughts.
Well, anyway, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I am just if you will it be fine if I take one more commentator, because I'm seeing Professor Gopa Samanta is with us.
Okay,
so,
all right.
So if Professor Samanta,
sure.
Yes, if you want to come in, Professor Samanta, can you hear us? So
unmute. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Soumyadip, for giving me this opportunity to come in. And it was wonderful to listen to Vishal. Actually, I'm very happy to hear Vishal, and I'm sure that Vishal is not trying to say that gender is an important factor to consider in natural resource management or peri-urban or whatever, because if I can remember correctly, Vishal was here in Bardhaman University, was speaking on water, and that time he was mentioning that even irrigation sector, how the problem aggravates, like probably the entitlement of land was in the it is in the name of a man in the family who is absentee farmer, and allocation of timing of in the middle of the night, and the woman in the family, she has to go to take the charge of irrigating her field. So I'm so happy that now Vishal is expanding this work on gender, and he is speaking that the people who like us, who are in the field of academia, and we have to supervise master's thesis or maybe PhD thesis. So maybe we can look into that, how gender, we can accommodate gender in different issues which we are trying to talk about. And so the other day I was just thinking, when I was reading, for one reason I was reading in detail the documentation of sustainable development goals, and I was thinking that 7 out of 17 goals, 1 is given for gender equality, just like a 7-compartment train, and 1 compartment is dedicated. Because everything we talk about, even if we talk about climate change, how can we leave gender? So gender is structural inequality. It is everywhere in each sector, in each theme. So as soon as we recognize that, and rather than taking it into the account that like everything is gender neutral, and it's not actually we are gender blind, so we don't see gender as a structural inequality. So it is always good to bring in, and I'm very happy, Vishal, that you brought in this idea that even if we are talking about peri-urban, gender needs to be addressed. And I also agree to some extent with Mr. Unahale that yes, sometimes peri-urban also facilitates women. Like I was reading one PhD thesis from South Asian University, and that girl has worked on Gurgaon and the gender question, and she is from sociology background, and showing that even within Gurgaon, the traditional village feudal structure and how this structure is getting transformed a little bit, which is like bringing a fresh oxygen for the women in the village. So maybe there are other issues, cultural and social advancement, but definitely, like Vishal has already pointed out, that it's not that comparable that I'm talking about a hill city and peri-urban, where the villages are heavily dependent on natural resource collection. So there definitely would be a different story of gender question, and which might not match with Gurgaon or any other peri-urban location in around Kolkata or Mumbai. But I think it is very important for us that we try to look into the gender disaggregated database. We try to develop gender disaggregated database, and we try to look. We better try to look at the gender question rather than being just like, gender blind. So it was a wonderful talk, and of course everybody and also my feeling is still, as Vishal has pointed out, that always we try to portray that apathy of state and planning, etc. But everybody nowadays there is a lot of argument like planning and master plan or the plan for a longer period of time is not going to work anyway, because situation is changing so fast that even the time period a planner develop and try to accommodate or implement, then the whole lot of things, ground reality changes so fast. So even these days there are a lot of discussions like Gautam Van is talking about, that incremental development, incrementality, informality should be acknowledged. And so probably we need a better lens to look into the peri-urban. And of course my gender is a question, and it's core to my it's very near to my heart. So that's why I'm very happy that when Vishal brings in this idea to the front and asks that we should look into gender whenever we are talking about either urban or rural or peri-urban. And definitely these dichotomous division of territorial division, that had changed a lot, I think, over the last couple of decades, because rural areas, socially, culturally, and this kind of cultural globalization kind of things, after that, we cannot probably divide that way. And sometimes it is also seen that peri-urban is under the rural governance, which is more beneficial, get more funds for something else. So it's probably becoming a nuanced space, and where messiness is more than have a very discrete kind of implications we see. So that's all. It's not just an additional comment kind of. It is not a question. I'm very happy to hear all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shamanto. First of all, thank you for joining this City Conversation Series talk today and sharing your thoughts. And as you have rightly pointed out, like actually the problem with this main course discourses on urban development is that we always try to see the cities as the place of deficits. Like we are thinking about the governance deficit, we are thinking about their weak financial health and so on and so forth. And as in fact, Dr. Narain also mentioned about in his talk that one of the real challenges is to how to integrate these informal practices which are pervasive in these peri-urban areas into the formal governance structure, whatever in whatever form they are in the peri-urban areas, and this could have important gender implications as well. So before winding up, I think let's again go back to all our discussions, because just a quick maybe a minute or so, if you can share your final thoughts, then we'll come back to Dr. Narain for his final concluding thoughts. So let's start with again the same order, Dr. Nallathiga. Maybe your thoughts on just maybe in a minute or so. So are you? So are you?
Please unmute. Yeah. I'm sorry. Thanks for such a wonderful discussion, which also has given a lot of insights to me. I just conclude that, like, apart from what I have raised, what also comes to the fore is that, like, how do we go about the planning in the peripheral areas, which requires a very, very different approach from what we do in the case of the central core cities is coming to the fore. So which requires, as Professor Narain also outlined, a different kind of skill sets, a different kind of orientation, different kind of approach. And that's where even some of the Western thinking is also like more about a collaborative planning approach, and more about a participative approach, and more about engaging the local communities and understanding the local institutions better, and trying to integrate them into the plans that are going to be developed. So they cannot be using the same apparatus what they use in the case of the mainstream cities. Rather, the approach has to be very, very different, and that orientation, that skilling has to be done as well in the curriculum as well as in the way they are trained subsequently also, as he has outlined. That is one thing which comes up. And yeah, that's all I have to say in a minute or so. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Nallathiga. Now it's over to Dr. Divya.
Thanks again, and I cannot thank you all enough for such thought-provoking questions, and also Dr. Narain for so thoughtfully reflecting on them. I particularly wanted to acknowledge Dr. Jinya Mukherjee's really enthusiastic and animated comment. I mean, your enthusiasm was contagious. I feel so energized. And it was fantastic. What really struck me, I mean, I just wanted to highlight that, you know, Jinya, in your comment, what really struck me was this politics of typology, that how when we use these certain terms like peri-urban or, you know, rural and urban, how that triggers a certain kind of, I think, perception of a particular context. And that I feel that, you know, that is so important. I mean, it's like the undertone, and it's very subtle, but at the same time, it has such an important role in the way we perceive and the way we enter these contexts. So thanks for highlighting that. And another, you know, point that I wanted to highlight, which was again something that Jinya shared, was, which really struck me, was how when we think about the context of gender or vulnerability, we view these people as passive audience and passive adapters. But then the reality is something else. I mean, these are the people through whom, you know, they're, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to box them, you know, their role, really, like, you know, understand their role. So that was, again, like, you know, something that struck me. So, I mean, I just wanted to communicate that there's so much that I've learned through this panel, and I'm so grateful that I could attend it. So thanks everyone, and thanks to Dr. Narain especially, and all the panelists.
Thanks, Dr. Divya. Yeah, thank you for your comments. And now it's turn to Meenakshi.
Hi again. I just want to emphasize few things. One was what Professor Vishal probably already mentioned, and I think somebody else also mentioned in a different way. We as academicians tend to write papers, which is, I think, partly a requirement of our profession. And one thing is the abstract part, the other is the empirical part. And once you go up to reaching communities or different actors, I think what we need to focus, and especially as public policy scholars, where are actually the areas, like I said, if you could have the right data, if you would know the different dynamics, what are the sort of threads which are sort of work in one space, whereas which don't work in another space, then we can have the sort of a set of public policy interventions where we can mitigate problems. That's one thing which I wanted to already mention. The other was about the governance. I think a lot of people have raised the issue in different ways in peri-urban areas. And like Professor Vishal rightly mentioned, especially in the Indian context, there is no definition as to what is peri-urban. It could be a greater Hyderabad metropolitan region, it could be NCR in Delhi, it could just be a rural urban intersect in another part of the country. So, but still, having said that, I think if there is some kind of mapping in terms of research and all, if there's what kind of governance or what kind of body is there, for instance, it's just if it's not a metropolitan agency, then we do have nowadays, I know in a lot of states, still not formalized district planning committees. Can we push for those if they can be effective ways of sort of leveraging certain tools or leveraging sort of empowering these communities? Can we come up with institutions? I mean, since we're talking about gender, health, occupational, or whatever education, whatever can we do? Can these planning agencies or statutory bodies, can they be useful, or will they just add to the burden? I think these are some of the issues which probably, if mapped out, can sort of help us really, like I said, where can be public policy as a policy, as it can be sort of a partner with policymakers, non-government organizations, academy or as an academic researchers, yes, or with government, and help and sort of create bridges. So that is what I want to conclude with.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Meenakshi. Yeah. So now, yes, Dr. Jenia, for your
yes. Thank you very much. I have also learned a lot, of course, from this lecture and the discussions. And I think like one specific point which I would also like to highlight very much, in lines with the comment made by Vishal sir, is that why it is important for us to also rely upon multimodal dissemination tactics or strategies for that matter. So like so for example, I think it's high time for us to really come out of our comfort zones and push our frontiers as much as possible. So what I'm trying to say is that, like, if we really want to collaborate with other sectors, so if there has to be this multi-stakeholder engagement, it's very easy to kind of say and very loosely blurt out these terms like multi-stakeholders, participatory, inclusive. But how do we go about this? We really need a very very in-depth but at the same time robust yet feasible methodological design through which this can occur or happen slowly and steadily. And I think sir also mentioned that I think that academicians, they really have a role to reach out to the wider society. So I attended like a very interesting workshop, I think 3 years back, which was conducted by Rekha Ranganathan from IIHS, Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Bangalore. And there she talked about that each and every academician, when he or she completes one very good piece, which, for example, has been published in Environment and Urbanization, or for that matter, any other good journal, Global Environmental Change. But why he or she also needs to communicate a very small piece, maybe an opinion piece of the same argument for the wider society, in any of these like platforms, any of these like popular platforms, so that the crux of the argument anyone and everyone can actually read. Because otherwise our NGO partners or the grassroots organizations people or the policy makers, for example, urban scholars, peri-urban scholars, in the last 2 decades, I think they have produced like fascinating pieces of work. But unfortunately, we are not being able to communicate our message to the larger, neither the majority people for whom we are speaking, or we are trying to assert our voices for them. That is at least what we quote unquote claim about. But unfortunately, we are not being able to either reach them, or nor the policymakers or the bureaucrats are being able to make sense of what we are arguing about. So I think it's high time, and also for the students. So for example, like the BTech students, MTech students coming from different backgrounds, computer science, naval, aeronautics, so many other different disciplines. But how do I make these students understand what is the peri-urban? And also so many terms like peri-urban, suburban, rurban, urban rabi. So how do I really come up with some very significant mechanisms through which they can really understand what peri-urban is all about? So maybe field investigations or field exposure visits can be conducted, and there can be like sketches, photo essays, exhibitions, visual immersions, whatnot. If we really want to kind of research not only in the peri-urban aspect, but several other aspects which otherwise are like fascinating concepts which are being discussed upon since the last 2.5 decades. But but still we really need to consolidate by widely reaching out to all strata, all sections, all age group of the society, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jenia. And then let's go request Mr. Unale, if you want to share some final thoughts in a minute.
Yeah, this has been a very interesting discussion all the way. And I think looking at the specific governance intervention on gender vulnerability in peri-urban area. If you just just few words on that, that there is the way the rural administration looks at gender vulnerability is might be a bit different from what the urban local bodies do, and therefore there might be a gap into this, and some identifying of vulnerabilities for gender needs to be brought on same page from both rural and urban as far as peri-urban is concerned. Secondly, the manpower deployment, which is normally done within the government, like the manpower that the Jilla Parishad or the rural panchayats have, and what the urban local body might be having, probably some mechanism of they talking to each other and probably working together is something, some flexibility, as I said, also needs to be tried. The traditional way of administration is found wanting in many ways, and therefore innovation in governance is also an important part, generally as well as specifically on gender issues. So thank you for that. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, before just listening to some concluding thoughts from Professor Narayan, so let me now request Dr. Arjun Kumar, who is the director of IMPRI. So if he wants to chip in and share your thoughts or comments. Yeah.
No, sir. We can have concluding remarks from Vishal sir. Already
Okay, that's great. Time. Yeah, Kapur. Yeah. So it's over to you, Professor Narayan. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So just like everybody else, I also learned a lot in this webinar, and I think it's been one of the most productive and engaging webinars that I've been part of, in the recent times, especially from the contributions from all the discussants. So, and I could identify also very closely with the last round of comments. So one is like, how do we identify the peri-urban? How is it different from the suburban, the urban? So when I have to explain peri-urban to my students, I say that it's what you see when you drive along a highway. So if you drive between one city and the other, so, I mean, pictorially, that's peri-urban. And I find that as the most effective way to get this message across. Also, I think that for those of us in academics, integrating our research, and for those of us who are working on the peri-urban, so integrating our research with the teaching is a very effective way to build a critical mass of interest and research on the peri-urban. So if you bring your own, peri-urban paper to the classroom, yeah, and then you have a captive audience of like 30 students, 40 students who suddenly get, get interested in the peri-urban. So I think that's a quick way also of creating interest, of creating a body of knowledge on the peri-urban in the long run. And Gopa, yes, it was so nice to connect with you after a long time. And yes, as you mentioned that when I came to Burdwan, I was not working so much on gender, and I just had a peripheral interest. And it was only over the years that when I started seeing gender in the field that I started consolidating my ideas. So as I said that, I never started off as a gender researcher. I did not go to the field, investigating gender relations, specific questions, but it was so basic that it always came up. And over time, I ended up consolidating all my insights on gender and then trying to put them together. But the point that also Gopa was saying about, why one SDG on gender, I think it works both ways. So at the one level, we have to mainstream gender in whatever we're talking about. At the same time, if we just leave it to mainstreaming, it's possible that it gets neglected. Yeah, so then it makes sense to have like one separate box on gender so that it's there, so that you make sure it's there. Yeah, so I think it works both ways. So gender is a cross-cutting issue. It needs to pervade our thinking no matter what. So there's no aspect of our life that is not gender, right? So it has to be a cross-cutting issue. At the same time, having a separate little box there makes sure that it's not left to chance. So I think it works both ways. So with that, thanks very much, and thanks to IMPRI so much for a very nice, gathering of discussants who could stimulate further reflection and help me consolidate my own thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Narayan, for your wonderful talk. And this session has indeed been quite engaging. And we are really thankful for you for highlighting the importance of this gender lens to understand the vulnerability of the peri-urban areas. And also, as Dr. Divya mentioned, this discussion is being truly contagious because it encourages us to deep dive sort of into all these similar sorts of research issues. So once again, from the team IMPRI, we are thankful to Professor Vishal Narain. We are thankful to all our panelists, Dr. Ramakrishna Nallathiga, Dr. Meenakshi Sinha, Dr. Divya Gupta, Dr. Jenia Mukherjee, Mr. Samir Unhale, and also we are thankful to Professor Gopa Samanto for joining this session. So we are also hopeful that we will be able to have you in our future city conversation series as well. So with this, so thank you from once again from Team IMPRI, and yeah, it's stay safe and take care all. Yeah, it's good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.